What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. This is the Elder Scrolls podcast. I'm Scott here with Michael and Drew, as always. And today we are talking all about the Direnni Elves. We're back with a lore-focused topic for today. So, which one of you guys would?
Well, look, I think the Direnni need a bit of credit. You know, like of all the migrations to Tamriel, the Direnni are the forgotten ones. Let's be real. Like, you know, obviously you got the Kaima who become the Dunmer, the Ayleids who are, you know, we like the Ayleids, but the Direnni, like, arguably had one of the biggest impacts on Tamriel. The amount they've done. Yeah. For so many things, you know, we'll touch on all of these soon, but before even leaving Somerset, you've got one guy who's got like a crappy farm that has terrible soil, stony, loamless, and he manages to basically advance alchemy to lay the foundations for what alchemy becomes. You've got, they push enchanting, because enchanting used to be like 19 times out of 20 it would fail. Enchanting became a viable form of magic. You've got conjuration. You've got, there's more as well.
They pioneered a lot of things, didn't they?
And they pioneered everyone's favorite race, the Bretons.
Pioneered is the way to put it.
I mean, they're the ultimate flex kind of family line as well. I mean, there's literally that quote that says, few families in Tamriel can boast so many famous figures wielding so much power over the fate of so many. Our warriors and kings are stuff of legend. And then it goes, and it is not to dismiss their honor and their achievements to say you have heard quite enough about them. That is peak snob. I'm not saying it's not earned, but it's like, yeah, we're so famous, so successful, so significant that if you just want to stop talking about us for a bit, that's fine. It makes sense. It must be hard to always hear about how successful we are.
Well, I would be curious to know how much of their history is played up a little bit, because you've got, if you look at the Direnni estates in Somerset now, or like, you know, say contemporary with ESO in the Second Era, they have these incredible lands with these beautiful palaces and whatnot. But they started off with just, as I said earlier, one guy on a farm who pulled some amazing feats by so apparently he managed to, a girl was being preyed upon by a vampire, so he came up with a potion that turned her bloodstream to poison. Didn't hurt her apparently, but it killed the vampire when it tried to feed on her. And then there was also raiders coming down the coast, and he gave everyone invisibility potions. And then when the raiders came along, it's like, we want you to make this invisibility potion. So he makes an invisibility poison. He's chewing on the cure as he does it. He takes the poison. He's all sweet. But then all the raiders die.
Yeah.
And then he gets picked up by the Psijics.
That's right. He was chewing like some black lichen root or something.
Brush.
Yeah, something like that. And basically had that in his mouth so that when he drank his own poison, nothing would happen.
It does come off like a bit of a glorified story. But hey, look where they are now. Well,
sure.
Actually,
look where they are now.
Look where they are now.
Well, they're kind of,
any great empire will fall eventually.
Well, they're kind of where they started in a way, somewhat, because when they start, so, you know, there's the whole like leaving for, new horizons and so on, venture into the new world away from Somerset. And they come upon the Isle of Balfiera, and there's the Adamantine Tower, which obviously has a lot of like cultural significance, well, kind of to everyone in some way and so on. But that's where the Direnni sort of start, which is in the middle of the Iliac Bay in the Isle of Balfiera. But then obviously the Direnni hegemony gets quite busy and starts spreading into High Rock. So High Rock at that time, I'm pretty sure it's the middle Morathic era is the timing for when they're here. So High Rock at this time is probably needs. I mean, Topol says orcs and stuff. Which
I imagine there could be some goblin Ken type things, but it was mostly needs. And to be completely honest, compared to some of the other elves who left the Somerset Isles and ventured out, it wasn't that bad for the Direnni. I mean, like, look at the Kaima who traveled to Morrowind and had actual full-on civilizations like the Dwemer to deal with, you know. It wasn't too bad going, and it's like, oh, here's a bunch of, like, needs. We're just going to kind of become their overlords.
Stomp all over them.
They were fairly contemporary with the Ayleids as well. So it was around that time. So when they pushed north, they would absolutely have encountered the goblin clans, and there would have been one of the Nedic groups that wasn't affected so much by the Direnni were the Dyraki Needs, who actually prospered, but they were more in the kind of Craglorny Hammerfell region. So it seems as though the Direnni were like, we see Hammerfell, obviously it's not called Hammerfell at this point, like, we don't really want any part of this, so they just skip straight by it.
This was such a shower thought, and I just kind of want to inject it, like just a shower thought to bring up, but like everyone generally, I feel like in the community have a tendency to think of things in sort of like their modern province construction of like what the like state looks like or how things are. And like, I mean, people even do that in our real world history, but like how like, early on there's like city states or different sort of political breakups, and people don't like, necessarily like some concepts of like what High Rock is or Skyrim or Hammerfell like aren't necessarily there yet.
Basically everything's not there yet. Like all the kingdoms, all the like, High Rock's this province of turmoil, and this kingdom of Wayrest is fighting this one. None of that was even there, because that's all from the Bretons, which is the result of what the Direnni ended up doing, which was interbreeding with the Needs.
And see, what's interesting, I wonder, is there is this sort of weird gap. It's like, where did the Snow Elves come from? Because if you're thinking about at that time,
they're such a mystery.
At that time, you've got the Direnni, and they're, doing their thing, making Bretons, and they're expanding into the Nedic tribes and so on. But at that same time, you've got the Snow Elves there, which are sort of supposedly, have been there for a while and so on. And perhaps there's theories about the Snow Elves being like, they were like the cast off kingdom, because there was once an Atmoran kingdom of elves and so on, and maybe they're the cast offs or something. Or maybe they diverged from Direnni or something. It's kind of hard to say with certainty. But yeah, it's just interesting that, like, so they're spreading from Balfiera, these Direnni elves, they're hitting lots of tribes and then basically turning them into... arguably, I would say they kind of somewhat probably civilized them, right? I mean, like, it sounds awful because it's like by virtue of like giving them like castes and nobility structures and stuff that are different from their own, but they would have, I mean, not that the Nedic tribes or Nedic, I mean, arguably kingdoms and stuff at the same time. Like, there's plenty of small Nedic kingdoms and stuff like that, like kind of how you would imagine like ancient, they're not in the modern conception of like Skyrim as a kingdom, but
I suppose they were kind of like, in some ways they were the best treated, like, local population, but at the same time, it's still pretty bad. But it's kind of just that thing where it's like, well, they did survive because they were integrated into the society. They didn't have to, be subject to intense slavery and flesh sculpture, torture, arts, and then have some big Elysian rebellion rise up kind of situation. Nor were they hunted down and slaughtered by all the Nords returning from Atmora.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, sorry, I was just going to say one extra little thing is just another to help frame it and so on. We'd have to double check this is what it says on the US, but the Adamantine Tower is rediscovered by the Direnni and everything, but before the Crystal Tower is even built on the Somerset Isles. Just it's interesting. So it is pretty like early on, but sorry, go on, mate.
Yeah, well, we can go down a whole rabbit hole with the Adamantine Tower because, like the White Gold Tower and the Crystal Lake Law were essentially built as to mimic it because, you've got sources, which I can read out later, that essentially say that once you actually look at the Adamantine Tower properly, you can prove that it's impossible to be built by mortal hands. So it essentially, it had to be the Zero Tower, the tower built by the gods. But I was going to say on the topic of like how they treated the Needs, it kind of is the ultimate irony for the Dirennis because what they essentially tried to do was rather than horribly subjugate them, which you can argue this is a form of that, it was genetic assimilation basically. So they wanted to assimilate these savages into their superior culture by breeding with them and kind of giving them this middle class. But in the end, the Needs were far more abundant than them. And we're going to see how that plays out for them.
I mean, just to clarify for everyone, because we've been dancing around the topic, there was basically a rule put in where the high elves, the Direnni, could interbreed with the Needs legally, basically take concubines. They would even compete with each other, like who has the most attractive concubines and things like that.
They were like trading cards, basically.
Yeah. Do you know what the name was? There's actually a name.
Perquisite of Coition.
The Perquisite of Coition. And basically, they would interbreed with them.
Is it coition or coercion?
Coition. Coition is in coitus.
Ah, okay, yeah.
So basically, like a fancy way of saying we have the right to have sex with you.
Yeah.
But so I guess to reframe it as well, it's not like some like holy, we're here to uplift them. It's like, oh, here's some savages to them. We can just, screw them, and then we can also just have them farm our lands, do everything. But the happenstance of that is it created the sort of half-class Bretons that sort of could go like, oh, well, I'm part elven or something, so I'm above the rest of you humans, and then that sort of caste kind of
the more elven you
structure
were,
got built out.
The higher up you were in society.
That's the thing, because they are. Sorry, I was just going to say they're very closely tied to their high elven roots.
Yes.
So you can see why they'd have that attitude. Sorry, go on.
Interestingly, too, I think it is. I actually have to double check. Maybe it's on here. It's either I think it's Finaster that is their. There is one of the gods in particular is like their sort of patron god, of the Direnni. Can't remember.
It's either Finaster or Ciribane, but Ciribane's more of the Sigic, so I think it is Finaster.
Every time I hear Ciribane, I just think of how I heard it pronounced in Elder Scrolls Online, and it was like Ciribane or something. I was
He's
like,
Italian.
It was like, really? It was like Matamarco and Vanis Galerian on the Isle of Artaeum, I think, in Trader's Vault, and then you're like watching a projection, and it's like Ciribane or something.
Yeah, it's just off. I'm trying to. I think it was Finaster, but I'll have to double check. But the point is that they have a sort of obviously they derived from the sort of Aldmeri kind of pantheon kind of thing. But then maybe I think it is Finaster or so on, and he's the one who taught them how to live an extra 100 years using a shorter stride and so on.
Yeah, that's
but sort of.
Right.
But using that like sort of ingenuity or so on, like how that kind of like cultural reverence of that god could bleed into them pioneering in all other kinds of ways and so on. There's a little bit of a sort of like forward thinking sort of progress driven thing, I guess, with the Direnni or so on, I feel.
Oh, for sure. And if they were being particularly like haughty about it, you can imagine they'd be incredibly competitive amongst each other. I mean, like Drew was saying in the opening, they did all these different things. I think when you were talking about conjuration, I think the explanation for that was that, which there's so many Direnni names to remember. There's a whole list of them.
Corvus and Kalani.
Yeah, basically he made it so that the spell to summon the creature from oblivion, but to like bind it there was kind of the same thing. Before, it seemed to me that it was more of like a two-step process, and that made things more dangerous. Whereas he kind of pioneered like the conjuration spell that we all know about.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I was going to say this is at a time where you don't really have classifications for magic. So there's a description of like Corvus and Kalani and their clan throwing open the doors of oblivion, and they're essentially the first to ever really poke their head in beyond the mortal realm. So you can imagine how terrifying that would be. So you kind of have to be committed to the the advancement of magic and something that kind of transcends just your race's longevity.
To confirm, it is Finaster that was seen as a hero god and teacher and patron deity of the clan Direnni, and that's why Finaster's worship's carried on over to the Bretons, and usually about like worship by mages and so on that sort of emphasize it. But that sort of like kind of innovation, the sort of walking stride to reduce your age and so on, or to live longer, and that kind of like enterprising hero god kind of vibe that you can imagine how that affects like the Dirennis.
Efficiency as well.
Yeah,
like it's a very hyper efficient way of thinking. Like, walk this way, you'll get more mileage. You'll live longer. It's more fuel efficient, But yeah, they were conjuration, like really conjuration pioneers. Some of the stuff, mind you, is very like, let's justify silly Elder Scrolls Online things, like this Direnni member was the first to summon a Flame Atronach horse, which was used in the Battle of Glenumbra Moors, and this one was the first to summon I think it was like an Iron Atronach Sench to free her from captivity. Like, there was a bit of Mount's lore in there.
Yeah, I mean, to chuck in some cope, you can definitely draw plenty of connections between the Direnni and the Sijic Order, because obviously you've got Asliel, who I mentioned at the beginning. He's like the alchemy one. He went to the Sijic Order to study. And then, you hear a lot about on Isle Balfiera, there's a lot of kind of secret rituals and research that's undergone, and it plays into their role with the Bretons, because obviously what they do to create the Bretons is not a very nice thing, but they clearly would have some respect for their kind of crossbred children, because there's mention of, I think, the first visitor to the Sijic Isles, to Artaeum, who isn't a high elf, is actually a Breton called Vernet, who is sent by the Direnni to meet Iakesis and study on the art. So, like, if they're really a subjugated class, you wouldn't be sending them on a field trip to the most secretive high elven place.
I guess it depends how elven they are too.
Real quick too, the attitudes can change, just to like contextualize it. So like the difference between first and fourth era is 4,500 years, but basically the somewhere really early, it kind of seems, it says Middle Merethic, and look, don't know exactly, it's hard because there's no pinned times, but the Adamantine Tower was rediscovered by the Direnni pretty early. So at the very least, you've got 1,000 years, but probably something closer to 2,000 years until the first era, when they really hit prominence. But they've been able to sit there in High Rock, build up their stuff, build up their society and stuff for a long, it's quite a long time for them to establish their society and sort of create a Breton race. That makes sense too. Like, Bretons can't be created overnight. Like, this is a long...
Well, technically yes, but I know what you mean. Like, an individual Breton would be created overnight.
Yes,
but,
like as a distinct race, and there's obviously the whole like racial phylogeny.
Well, we can talk about that briefly to kind of explain that, because I think in racial phylogeny they're saying that the offspring basically have the traits of the mother with some traits of the father. So that's one of the theories or contributing factors as to why the Bretons look like they do, because you can imagine a bunch of male elven kind of like aristocrat types, and they're collecting female Nedic concubines. So then the Bretons look more Nedic, closer to human. The other idea is that it's a gradual, like, kind of breeding out of the elven traits simply by the fact that you have Bretons created, but then Bretons can interbreed with other needs. And then they can so it all mixes and dilutes over time, especially when you look at the idea of like elven birth rates and things like that. I mean, eventually what we'll get to is that was kind of their undoing, because they got so outnumbered to the point where their own empire, their own culture was essentially disintegrated by the Bretons and the culture that they formed after.
One thing, this is sort of to throw a little spanner in the works, just about some of the timeline stuff in regards to how much time they did have with the Bretons. Just as an anecdote, this is something I think the ESO has done really well and so on. It's created a more like complex view of like the early histories and so on. But traditionally, there's that whole idea that it's like 1,000 to 800 years before the Merethic era is like the earliest signs of human settlement in Tamriel. And sort of the idea is this is all like Atmore and migration, that they're exclusively there and they came, rather than them actually being somewhat native and so on. But I sort of lean towards more the native kind of idea, because to me it seems more likely that these Nedic tribes, the Durakinedes, all of these kinds of cultures have emerged. Because if there weren't men there, right, until 1,000 years before, you've got like some 1,000 years of the Direnni just chilling in the Adamantine Tower High Rock area with nothing going on, no needs or anything, because there would theoretically be no humans. And the same as sort of the kind of deal with the Aelids. It kind of seems strange that they didn't come and then find somewhat human tribes around, or migrating in to enslave, like migrating in as in from Skyrim, rather than this idea that they all just come over on boats and then march across. Do you know what I'm sort of getting at?
Yeah, it's hard to say what the order of events would have been, because if you assume that while the Direnni may have been somewhat abundant towards the beginning, I always got the impression that they were never so abundant that they had total control of the entire area that we now know as High Rock. And I feel like if they did predate the Needs, and the Needs came along, maybe they would enslave them and take them as concubines, but you could see them just like never ever really letting the Needs get any footholds beyond the edge of the province.
You can really imagine like an Iliac Bay sort of situation, because there's all those mountain ranges like in between High Rock. You can imagine them just sort of like on the inner sides of controlling Iliac Bay. Like it would be, just the ability to trade and move around and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. To me, it seems strange, the idea that they're not there and there's at least some Nedic presence there. I I feel like there should be, or
Yeah.
so on. I'm not sure if I buy like because once again, it's the traces of the earliest human settlements. There might not just be traces of before, but it kind of seems strange that the Dothraki needs aren't there or anything, and then all of these sort of cultures then have to like arrive in Tamriel and then somehow carve out a space at a weaker spot in these already established elven places. Do you know what I mean? Kind of. You know what
sometimes
I mean?
sometimes it just be like that. You know what I'm saying?
Sometimes it be like it do, yeah.
It's just, I don't know. The lore is what it is.
Yeah.
Full stop. That's the end.
Full stop. That's what I have to say about your massive tension.
I've never liked the term "it is what it is." It's like, well, I already knew that because it is. Like, what value? I'm not shitting on you, just in general.
Real quick too, if you were taking in the Tamrielen Tractates, which is that source that talks about the where the Nord party finds the first Bretons, that they kill them at first thinking they're elves, so it's like, oh well, they're humans. That is supposed to happen like late in the Merethic era, and according to that, it's like apparently they've been overbreeding for 10 generations. But 10 generations, I'm pretty sure, I'm not sure what you consider a generation, if that's 15 or 25 years. Like, I feel like the modern sort of conception is around 15. But
And would that be Nedic generations as well? Or
well, that would
Elven
have
generations?
10 generations between Need and Ultima. So that's like them banging for 10
fair.
generations.
Yeah.
So then you've got... So that... I don't know if it's 15, but like...
But who wrote that?
Cozy.
Because a
is a Nord,
generation to an elf is like very different.
It's written in the first era, year 200, by Cozy, who I don't know if there is actually
Cozy.
what he is.
How do you spell that?
Khosey.
Does the source reference like the fact that they look distinctly unhuman, like they look elven?
Well, I can read it. It says it was notably written in old. Oh, hold on. Is this the actual?
I know the source you are talking about.
Don't Google Cozy.
Yeah.
You'll just get chicken noodles.
Yeah. It's famous. The book is famously credited for providing a first-hand account of the Bretons. Maybe it's one of those things that's referenced. The actual book is referenced in another book, saying that this book said that.
I'm trying to remember where I read it.
Hold on.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's in the first edition High Rock. It says Pocket Guide to High Rock. It says Cozy in his Tamrielen Tractates, so it's just mentioned, transcribes a first-hand account of the discovery of the Bretons by a Nordic hunting party. The Bretons, in 10 generations of elven intermingling and slavery, had become scarcely recognizable as humans. Indeed, the hunting party attacked them, thinking they were some new strain of Aldmeri, halting their slaughter only when one of the oldest began to wail for their life. A shrieking plea that was spoken in broken Nordic. Which is interesting as well. Which you could assume, though, is some like related language family, but yeah.
See, I can totally understand why the Bretons become almost human-looking by the modern times, but I definitely think having the elves be a stronger strain and their genes being dominant would be way cooler for the race, and having them look kind of like the image that you associate with Bretons that comes up first on the wiki would be nice.
There's an extra part here. So when word reached Windhelm, the Nords reasoned that the man Mary, beyond the Reach, were in fact descended from the human slaves taken during the elven destruction of Sarthal. And then so King Vraga made the first priority of his empire the liberation of his long-tormented kinsmen in High Rock. So it's interesting there that in their sort of understanding of it, that really does go off the return. So you're only looking at like 500 years before the first era, the start of the first era, is when I guess they've just taken slaves. Elves have taken slaves from Sarthal, and then they've become.
Yeah, it's almost like there could be collaboration between the Snow Elves and the Direnni Elves in terms of like a bit of a slave trade going on.
Because sometimes it's like whether they're connected too. Like the Snow Elves maybe came from Direnni like early on, because if they've been there already, for example, for like 2,000 years.
Yeah. And adapting to the climate the same way that the kind of other groups of elves that migrate did.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of time for them to evolve as a race.
I would put once again, it's like that kind of when you've got conflicting sources, generally, I think this is our kind of job, and what we try to do just for the audience is when there's conflicting sources, we try and pick the ones that make the most sense with the broader picture. Because at the end of the day, you can go, well, this source says this and this says this, and that's an unreliable narrator. But if you can kind of build a better picture with the construction of these, and it makes a more cohesive tapestry, then generally we tend to go with that. So, like, personally, I would think that that isn't exactly right, and that the Nedics they were just Nedics that have been there for a while. But the interesting part there is that broken language about, like, broken Nordic. But you could easily have Nordic influence if they came... By the time this is this first-hand account or whatever, which is like, end of the Merethic era, if Nordics have been there for 400 years, their language could have spread through Nedic tribes and stuff in some capacity or something, or addition. Or maybe they have a very familiar root in
for sure
their language or something.
Because you can imagine it may appear like broken Nordic to someone, but it wasn't
Yeah,
really,
it's like
because broken Nordic was just their language with influence that's been around forever that probably influenced the Nordic language. And
well, yeah, I mean, like, look at, like, the Latin to all of the Romantic languages, all of the Spanish and Italian and so on. Like, there's lots of familiar things in all of it, so you can imagine.
Yeah, and there are plenty of areas of High Rock that are much more Nordic when you look at them than Breton or Elven, like Farron and Johanna, I think, are the two. They look like Nordic cities, with the exception of, I don't think there's any kind of, like, Nordic architecture, but still... you can see how that would be very disconnected from the core of Direnni society.
Oh, another thing to support it as well, but I'm pretty sure... that's the thing we could just be writing problems, right? And you could, chalk it up to this, but Serana, so she says that she's surprised that there's an empire from Cyrodiil at all, right? Mm-hmm. And theoretically, it could be like, I don't know anything about the world, and I was, like, born in the interregnum period, like after ESO kind of thing, and that's where it happened. But then later, she sort of comments on the ruins of the Dwemer. She kind of comments like, I'm surprised they let it get like this, or something like, implying that she was sort of contemporary with them somewhat, which then puts her, like, first or Merethic era beyond. And then, so if you placed her early first era, like prior to the Elysian Rebellion, it's kind of in that period. But then you look at them, like, they apparently sacrificed a kingdom to Molag Balv and part of their ritual and so on, and, like, sacrificed a whole bunch of people. Like, Harkon was like a king or something. I'd have to double check that, but it's something like that. But with that scenario, it's kind of implies again, like, then there's needs that have been here developing for a while, or some sort of, like, human cultures. I know they're Nords. This is the thing we have to kind of consider too, the lore to the gameplay. Like, yeah, you go and Harkon and Serana are Nords, and, like, all of the Reachmen are Bretons, but there is obviously a genetic distinction between, like, what Bretons are supposed to be on the other side and what the Reachmen are. Like, the Reachmen, I would almost argue, are, like, more far removed from Elven interaction and mingling and stuff.
Yeah, and even their cultures reflect that as well.
Yeah. And then there's going to be, like, it's something I will work on soon, but, like, a picture of, like, I guess, like, a prehistoric Skyrim or Tamriel, like that, the whole, like, Nedic, the idea, the theory that basically I want to, like, gather up some stuff for it, but that Needs were a more Daedric worshipping sort of group from before. It's just an interesting, and hey, maybe that's why the Direnni, when they came, maybe that inspired a lot of delving into this sort of oblivion and conjuration and all that kind of stuff, because maybe they see, like, Nedic, Daedric sort of worshipping type Nedic tribes similar to Reachmen that are doing, like, certain rituals or something, or trying to communicate with their gods and so on. And maybe that, because before that, otherwise you'd sort of say, like, well, what's their real, I guess, exposure to these sort of ideas?
It to me as well, with the conjuration stuff, I find it quite interesting that they basically, like, I wonder what it was like before that. Like, if we were talking about Needs doing rituals, perhaps they really needed a Daedric prince to basically, give them some Daedric aid. Whereas the Direnni were able to use their understanding of magic and kind of forming these binding charts to do that without that. Like, it was basically, it's kind of implied that, like, I mean, here's one of the sentences from The Origins of Conjuration. It says, non-belligerent Atronachs offered something of a boon to Clan Direnni, acting as protectors and occasionally servants or familiars. Even the naturally mischievous imp was easily coerced into behaving. So there's this idea that all of the Atronachs and Daedra and stuff, maybe they could be given as almost like a gift from a Daedric prince temporarily to help, but they weren't actually like summoned by the needs. It seems like a very Direnni thing, like, oh, we have figured out how to bring Daedra in and have them do what we want and be allies to us.
And I think that's the good distinction there, is that generally what conjuration anyway is dominion over that thing when you summon it. So, you know, there's the whole unbound Dremora thing, and because it's unbound to you, you can summon that to get it to bring you a sigil stone or whatever, and you try and kind of tame it. But the whole kind of concept, I guess, in the lore or so on, is that they're summoning these Atronachs, and they've got a sort of strong hold over it in communion. They're controlling it. It's like bound to their will. Whereas before it feels more like, you know, a sort of like, oh, you know, Daedric Prince, give us this, or even other Dremora or something, but it's a very like exchange, pact, ritual kind of oriented thing, rather than zip, I'm just going to pull you from oblivion and you do what I say.
It is interesting too to wonder just how true it is in the book, because it kind of implies that the Direnni are also responsible in part or significantly for the fact that there are interactions between Daedric realms and Tamriel. Like, it talks about, oh, they flung open the doors so far to the Daedric plains and it became impossibly difficult to shut.
What if it's all like this like big like Direnni revisionism kind of thing, because at the time they are arguably one of the longest lasting elven powers in those northern areas and so on, because they obviously retreat like later, and they also have like somewhat like a cooperation and reverence of Bretons and so on in the caste system for a while. But because, you know, the Aelids and so on bite the dust, the Snow Elves bite the dust, all of these sort of things around them that interact with mankind, and then the Direnni could kind of maybe position themselves as like, yeah, we did this and that. So like disregarding,
like they washed out other people's contributions almost, like
because
hijacked it all and said, and we did this, and this is our invention, and this is our invention, and kind of not give credit
because they're the last one that can take credit for it. Like, no, Aelin's going to come and contest them and say, no, we were doing conjuration back then. It's like no.
Because Aelids were meant to be like conjuration masters and stuff.
Well, they get credit for alteration.
Yeah, but good at conjuration, or was it? I swear there was.
Well,
something.
they were saying
I guess
they
once they started.
To be fair, actually, in the text, I'm pretty sure it's they made deal with Daedric princes and did big sacrifices to summon armies of Daedra.
True. Yeah.
Plus,
so it could totally be right. The Direnni could be just,
and you know, tying it back to the needs, kind of with their rituals, is this does all predate the Elysian Covenant with Akatosh and trying to fix the holes in the mortal realm that allow the Daedra to walk so freely around. You know, this was all before that, so there's much more freedom.
I suppose you could argue that their contributions to conjuration kind of were the building blocks by which a lot of bad people did stuff going forward. But I don't think that's like a rock solid, like, kind of philosophy, because you could say that about anything.
But I agree that there are definitely little snippets of their history that kind of almost seem like they're delving into the fields of other groups. You know, you've got like there's an example like Peregrine Direnni, who drove an entire Regatta flotilla back to Sentinel by merging her very will with the waves of the Iliac Bay, kind of getting into that storm magic type of thing.
Feels very Sigic.
Yeah. And then you've got Peladil Direnni, who in a single day built Black Rose Prison from the scattered rubble of Lil Mafete ruins by summoning an army of stone Atronachs. It's like, what are you doing in Black Rose? That's all the way over in Black Marsh.
Yeah. That sounds like some Barsabic Aelid type stuff. The ones who fled because they were the Aedra worshipping Aelids who fled the Daedra worshipping ones that were, you know, that schism kind of happened in Cyrodiil and they left.
Because then there were also some, I'm pretty sure even the last king of the Aelids, he goes to High Rock and sets up for a while, doesn't he? I'm sure there was some interaction with them in the Direnni.
Loria and
he was welcomed with open arms, right?
He's part of the Battle of Glenumbra Moors against the Elysians.
Loria and Dinar and his people arrived in 375, and the Direnni gave them a place to settle.
Yeah, it's It's interesting looking at the time. Like I love trying to create like a big picture out of all of the time and like a cohesive sort of understanding of the things. But when does it the Battle of Glenumbra Moors is 482, and that's seen as the sort of end to Direnni dominance. Direnni are like fine on the Isle of Balfiera from that point onwards, but they're no longer, I guess, they delimit the dominant political factor of High Rock and the Iliac Bay and so on. They're now like just equivalent of like, oh, we're a noble, respected house, but we're not like the rulers of everything. And now the Breton kings sort of...
It is important to distinguish, I guess, is that the Battle of Glenumbra Moors against the Elysians, they won that battle, but it still led to the downfall because they just didn't have an abundance of Direnni elves, and eventually they just kind of naturally lost control of the province to the Bretons.
And I think it's worth mentioning as well how the Direnni did actually grow quite a lot and expand quite far. Like, besides conquering High Rock, they went into Hammerfell, they went into some parts, and they went into some parts of Skyrim as well, like going into Markarth in Skyrim, Ellenhere in Hammerfell. So they did actually expand, a decent amount. They didn't just chill out in the Iliac.
But that also ends, I think, too, before when the Skyrim conquest onto Varago, like before even Elysia, he stomps all over. They fight the Direnni of Germany. The
Imperials
and so on.
even, like Craglorn was lost to the Imperials in 479. In 480 and 482, the Elysian Order basically comes to High Rock. I suppose you could say the Direnni are already on the defense at that stage, having just lost territory. And then the Battle of Glenumbra Moors goes down, and they lose even more forces. And
it does always seem that they were trying to expand, but could never properly conglomerate any of the places they reached.
Yeah.
They weren't bringing it into their empire.
It's, and also I feel like too, everyone's, after the Battle of Glenumbra Moors, like everyone's sort of pitted against them. Somewhat like, the Elysians would still be against them, but like next door you were fighting with the Nords and so on, but now High King Wulfarth is the new king, and he's not a like pro-elven kind of guy. Like, so your neighbors now aren't going to go down. Plus, you also got the dealing with all of the reachment. The reach has always been historically like a wild area, and how you sort of get the reachment is a mix of like the Direnni taking over this area, then the Nords take over this area back, and then it kind of like has an effect on the population that remains there. But then you get a distinct sort of, population. Look, trying to fight from High Rock into Skyrim, or more so into Hammerfell or into Cyrodiil, is such a like, they're kind of constrained by geography there in the Iliac Bay, like the Direnni. Like, it's kind of hard to sort of spread. So they've got things working against them.
In the Battle of Glenumbra Moors as well, they got help from Hoag Merkiller, didn't they?
Yeah.
Which
and the Clovian estates, I'm pretty sure too, were at least somewhat involved.
And the Aelids were through Lelorian Dionar.
Because remember, the Elysian Order were not loved at this point in time.
No.
At all. It's not like when they first arose and it was this great liberating force. They've kind of been a bit tyrannical for a while.
The peak only lasts of like that sort of Elysian sort of emperor, where that's like you've got like Elysia or like the Emperor Belartza and so on, and you've got like the Minotaur Guardians of the Empire, all of that kind of stuff. That only lasts like 120 years before the Elysian doctrines kind of get enforced, and then it just becomes this crazy like zealot.
It's funny to think too that's like, only 100 and however many years, but it's like that's a whole human's life, like that, like they would go through multiple generations just in that phase. Because the first era, because it's so spread out, it makes everything feel like shorter by percentage. I mean, arguably, like we've said before, it didn't need to be so spread out. You could have chucked all that history into a much shorter time frame. But when you compare it to time frames from like the third era, it's like so much happens that would happen in like 600 years or more, thousands of years in the first era. At least that we know about. To be fair, it's not like we've got like a picture perfect timeline of the entire first era.
Yeah, well, especially because there's just like a 1200 year dragon break just in the middle, and it's kind of like, does that need to be there? But this is the nature.
That's
of the
when
Elder
it comes
Scrolls.
back to it is what it is.
Yeah. But the Direnni.
I mean, I think Well, we're seeing ESO expand more on Breton lore. So I think
the new trailer.
I haven't properly watched it, but I guess we can. I mean, I want to talk about it more, I think, in the next Hot Takes episode. But I still think there's a very high likelihood that the Direnni will be a serious focus of Elder Scrolls 6. And I think we've talked about this maybe in the Bretons podcast or maybe in the separate Direnni video, but there is a lot once you start looking into the lore of the Adamantine Tower, it does seem like perfectly suited to a main quest line.
Oh yeah.
A classic stop the Thalmor from unmaking the world. The clan Direnni are the keepers of the Adamantine Tower, especially if you can justify all the other towers going. Like that whole tower theory thing could just be they could just absolutely run with it, and it does give a cool
and I mean,
line.
yeah, and there is like a canon source that's like, to be honest, this is a guy called Beradamo the Signifier who writes about a lot of things and may or may not be completely reliable, but there's a little excerpt that sounds exactly like the main story that says, "We cannot solve the mystery of the Zero Stone and use it to open the argent aperture which it wards. At maturity, every Direnni of high blood is brought into the tower, conducted to the foundation vault and shown the Zero Stone. We are allowed to touch it once so as to feel the transcendent mystical power that courses through it, a power we have never been able to tap. And we are shown the argent aperture in the adjacent metallic wall, that door with its lock of 13 slowly counter-rotating rings, a portal we've never been able to open." I was like, yeah, well, obviously we need to open that now, don't we? Like, that's got to be a plot line.
It's just a really nice setup. It sounds clean. It has nothing to do with the main character being a dragonborn or some prophesized hero. I would be happy if that was the main story, and then outside of that, you have heaps of just fleshed out side quests and faction stuff going on. And I mean, not that they have to do this, but I could imagine as well with a centerpiece like that, you could even have a bigger element of choice in Elder Scrolls 6 than you've ever had before. Nothing huge, but even in the main story I'm talking, it could just be like the Civil War, like pick a side. But you know how New Vegas has you fight over Hoover Dam? Like the Adamantine Tower, I can definitely see like, who are you going to help kind of. But I don't think if you help the Thalmor, it's like, and now we unmake the world, and it just fades out to white and the credits roll.
I can just tell you, they're not going to let you. The Thalmor is going to be the default enemy in the way they're set up because the way they're angled, it's too like morally reprehensible.
It would be nice if you could side with them and still, in some way that's not forced, still lose. What if you lose the war?
Here's an interesting idea, but what if the options were whatever isn't the Thalmor, but then in joining the Thalmor, while you side with them and perhaps push their interests, maybe there's a schism within the leadership there where you have one who's more like, I'm going to unmake the world, and you just can't side with him. But in helping, if you choose to help the Thalmor, you help kind of like depose that leader and in place put a different Thalmor leader who's more about like the tangible, but still wants to take over Tamriel, but is like, oh, we got to get rid of these like philosophical kind of like preachers, madmen, obsessed with tearing down the mortal veils.
But it'd be cool if you could like be there when the big bad of the Thalmor like opens the door, and you've got like, I'm imagining like a Indiana Jones Ark of the Covenant kind of situation where they open the vault and everyone's face just melts off.
Yeah.
But who knows? Elder Scrolls 6 could be nothing about it whatsoever. But I think the fact that ESO is completely ignoring Hammerfell and completely ignoring the Red Guards guarantees that the Red Guards are the focus, more so than the Bretons.
Well, I also think, and you've seen some deserty rock kind of stuff and so on, but I also think Iliac Bay does change the focus for them in the way, you need boat travel. You kind of need like reliable, and that complicates things a little more. And unless they do High Rock and Hammerfell, because I feel like too that could be a sort of from an like kind of doing Daggerfall now in the way that it, except more of it too, more of the land. It kind of gives a sort of for the franchise like a fresh feel. Do you know what I mean? Like, look, we're taking the old thing and like putting, you know what I mean?
And
like,
especially being able to just say, even if they're not, I mean, I would hope they're fully explorable, but even if they weren't, just the fact that they can say set in 2 provinces, it just makes everyone in the audience at E3 or whatever be like, oh my gosh, double Skyrim, like two of them.
Yeah. I just, at the end of the day, don't like the idea of a giant body of water sitting in the middle of the playable map. It's just not a nice...
Yeah. But what if there's all these mini islands that are so small that they don't dot the map, and it's kind of like that
Elder Scrolls 6 Black Flag.
But that's what I mean. It becomes a Navy sort of oriented game. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, if you don't use the boats, you're gonna have to.
But
do you know
what
I
if
mean?
it? But what if it's not super significant? Like, let's just say with the boats, you can go out and find a handful of unique, fun locations, little islands, maybe an old fort. But it would be like in someone's brain, it would be like, oh, I'm in Solitude. I need to go to Riften. Fast travel. Like taking the boat might be something you do once or only to explore some of the islands, but then everyone just fast travels. Like you don't walk. Do you know what I'm saying? Like in Skyrim, it's like, oh, there's this huge expanse between where I need to go. And if you've already explored it, there's no reason, unless you're doing some unique role-playing playthrough, that you need to walk it or travel it on horse.
Even then, like the Iliac Bay could be Elder Scrolls 7, and Elder Scrolls 6 could be more of a focus on kind of the front before the Iliac Bay, so kind of like Hammerfell versus Somerset clashing.
Could be.
And the Iliac Bay is still to come.
Look, I just hope with all this Microsoft money, we get an Elder Scrolls 7 that's not over a decade, a decade and a half potentially.
I think that's a hard thing to wish for, because it's so unlikely if they keep to the same group. But I think one thing that is realistic, which we're not really talking about Direnni right now, but would be much more spin-off games. Like they really, I'm all for them using the franchise in more ways than just ESO expansions.
We'll see. I think if we want to get back on track with the Direnni, one of the things that we could talk about is any significant members of the bloodline that we haven't talked about yet. Because I know there's a list here of different figures. They've done all kinds of things. They've been the Imperial Battle Mage, actually, multiple times. You had Jovrin, Imperial Battle Mage, to the court of the Dunmer Empress of Tamriel, Kataraya. You had Peladil, who was Imperial Battle Mage to the first ruling potentate, Versailles Shea. That was the one you said who did Black Rose Prison. Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess that one makes more sense if he's in service to an emperor.
He must be pretty powerful. Yeah. You've also got... I just want to say, too, it is interesting, the whole idea with alchemy, that basically... Because you told the story about the invisibility potion and stuff, but in the same way that they pioneered conjuration, supposedly, it was the same... And enchanting, like you said, it was the same with alchemy in the sense that it was turned into a science. Yeah. In the same way that magic was not as... structured in the past and was far more experimental and dangerous, it seems like the Direnni really built it into that science of like, here's how you mix ingredients, and probably, I wouldn't be surprised, all the different tools like your alembics and calcinators and all these different things to distill in this and increase potency, all the complexities of that, instead of more of that unhinged is the wrong word, unstructured feel of like, let's just mix these three things together, and basically how you play Skyrim, and let's eat this ingredient,
Imagine if she broke bad.
You also have that Medora Direnni, who was pretty prevalent in Daggerfall, because she was the kind of the court sorceress, but also mistress of King Lysandus. You have that whole treachery.
Have you seen who put the curse on her? Nulfaga. That is some scary stuff. There is not much that she creeps me out big time. Like, I look at that and I get some real like 90s claymation show that I watched as a kid and gave me nightmares. Like, that is a creepy.
I didn't realize how bad that was. Because what's the name of her dragon? She has a dragon as well that looks really dopey. Skakmat. That's the lad. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's a scary looking witch. Not a fan. There's also, I think Lady Thorne is actually listed as one of the Direnni, I believe. But she basically took over a castle in Skyrim, I believe. Like they were having vampire problems from. It sounds like a Castle Volkihar type situation. And then she's like, you know what? I'll clear this mess up. As long as I get to keep the castle. I'm pretty sure that was the story. And turns out she's a vampire lord. They didn't know. She killed them all, and then it became her little vampire lair.
Yeah. super based.
Well, look, I think the Direnni are without a doubt the most interesting part of Breton lore. I think everything we've talked about here, if this can be considered Breton lore, it's what makes a Breton interesting, because everything about the Bretons themselves.
That's what's so sad to me about the new the new ESO thing. It kind of just looks like, oh, you're just going on the sort of classic chivalry knight thing, the more of the same versus just even a little bit more.
Why was there? Why was there the hype though? I felt like maybe I'm just not as up to date, but I felt like usually when they do an expansion for Elder Scrolls Online, they don't hype it like that. Like it felt big. You know when you had the opening trailers and they're showing the ocean, and they're like, "We're gonna go somewhere like you've never been," and like, what? It's just an island with more Breton stuff on it.
It's like it's trying really hard to just be. I mean, I was saving this for the Hot Takes podcast, but it's kind of just this very generic, soulless kind of grimdark fantasy that just doesn't have any character of its own. It's like it felt like watching a Witcher trailer minus all of the things that make Witcher interesting. And I think they would be so much better off. Like you could easily do this by looking back at Daggerfall, because Daggerfall had so much of the kind of mystical, old school fantasy kind of appearance to it, and I think playing into more of the fairy tale element of like chivalry and knights and ladies and all of that would be much more interesting for High Rock.
I mean, imagine the trailer starts and it's some like druid revealing, like pulling their hood off, and there's all these like strange mystics and cults and
that's the thing. It's not. We're also not advocating for like, oh, like just completely flip it or so on. But providing some sort of like druidic sort of mystic cult and all of that kind of stuff creates a nice contrast against the noble stuff that's there and so on, and then creates a more interesting world versus just like, oh, it's just more knights. And I feel like they're going for that same sort of like, it's some sort of like, you know, there's that knight guy in the throne and the assassin's eye. It's just okay, another plot to overthrow some kingdom or something. Like I don't know.
Like look. To me, I couldn't tell if I was watching something about Elder Scrolls or just another like Netflix trailer for the next fantasy series they've just made that's going to be terrible, written by, you know, terrible writers, all of that stuff. Like,
he can't wait for season 3 of Witcher, can he? He's so keen. Yeah.
Doesn't give me much hope for the Breton race. I'll leave it there.
And if they also don't do High Rock in ES6, if it is just Hammerfell, then the Bretons will remain Breton-y standard humans to contrast every other human against.
That's all right. As long as they do Hammerfell really well, I'd be stoked.
I'm far more keen for Hammerfell. I'll be actually a little disappointed if it is High Rock.
Yeah, but I don't know. I'm just happy with a game, eh?
But if they just serve you up whatever.
At this point, that's kind of all they really need to do to satisfy us.
Mate, if you've been sitting in a restaurant for 15 years waiting for your meal to come, it's going to taste good because you'll be dying of starvation.
And I'm just so keen for like, imagine like if they really go interesting with the environments and so on, and they can pull a bit from like potentially like some of sort of the American geography of like the kind of like Utah and Arizona kind of stuff, and you know, with some African kind of geography and the interesting like kind of baobab trees, and then like deserts and stuff. I mean, I'm also biased. I really like deserts. Like visually, I think they're really cool.
There are some amazing deserts all around the world. If you go looking, Utah looks less unique. I mean, it still looks super cool, but like there's some awesome stuff. This is a bit off topic, but one of my favorite deserts, I'm pretty sure it's in Egypt. When I say favorite, I don't know everything about it, but it's covered in like white crystals. So there's like all this white sand, but it's almost like, you know, if you're playing Borderlands, there could be like, oh, we're on some place and there's generic crystals popping out of the ground. It's kind of like there's like crystals and I don't know.
It's kind of like, I feel like I've seen that on David Attenborough or something, where the wind blows. It's kind of like the dunes start to shimmer and stuff like that.
There's just some cool stuff, but
such cool potential to it.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like High Rock will just look closer to a Skyrim, just a little less cold in areas. And do you know what I mean? Or it's going to be a mix of Oblivion Skyrim rather than something fresh.
Yeah.
I think.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that brings us to the end of the Direnni podcast, unless you
peace out.
Unless you two just yeah, thank you so much everyone for watching. We really appreciate all of your support. If you want to help support the channel more, you can get a FudgeMuppet t-shirt, which now actually looks like our logo because we changed our logo.
Give it a
Yeah.
fresh 1,000,000+ subs
We've got a
change up, you know?
yeah.
Poggers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, social media links are in the description. And remember, I'm pretty sure next time we're doing Hot Takes Part 3. So don't
Yeah, I
miss
think
out on
so.
that. And make sure your takes are very hot.
It's going to get sweaty.
Keep
We're
'em-
going shirtless for it.
Try and keep them in the comments of the last
They're gonna
Hot
hold you
Takes
to that.
episode. They will hold you. Hey, yeah. I won't go there. Look, all I'll say is thank you again. And we look forward to nerding out with you again next time.